This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 610, entitled "The Divorce Courts are Based on the Fluffie Model." Description: Today's divorce courts are based on the assumption that most women are fluffies, that is, career incompetent women who expect to parasite off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life. Masculists are abolitionists who see fluffiedom as man's slavery and hence slavery, and thus hated and a war issue. Masculists are at war against fluffies and fluffy feminist hypocrites, especially against those fluffy feminist lawyers and judges who dominate the divorce courts, butchering one father in 4. Masculists aim to create a FIP society where both sexes are raised and educated to be FIPs, so that the divorce courts can operate on the principle of financial independence, where both divorcing parties are presumed to be FIPs. Masculists aim to destroy the assumption that the divorce courts are based on the fluffy model as they are today. Now the flyer itself. The divorce courts are based on the fluffy model by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. One of the major reasons why masculists are so hateful of women who commit massive gender crimes against men has to do with the massive gender injustice committed by women against men in the divorce courts, both by the fluffy divorcing women and by the fluffy feminist lawyers and judges who dominate the divorce courts. In some countries, for example the one I live in, Australia, there has been some partial reform in the divorce courts that benefit men. For example, divorcing Australian men usually get joint custody of the kids, and if the divorcing wife has a good career, that is, she is a FIP, then the divorcing husband is not forced to pay her alimony. But in many other Western countries, even these partial reforms are not the case. So men are truly butchered in the hated, fluffy feminist, hypocrite, genocider dominated divorce court system that crucifies one father in 4. One father in 4! Which is so monstrous a figure, so massive a gender injustice against men, generating such a hatred in masculists that it is a war issue for them. So masculists usually live the MGTOW lifestyle in practice, that is, refusing to marry, rejecting paternity, and spending their money on themselves. But masculists differ from MGTOWs in that masculists are political animals who fight for the men-fairing of the gender laws by lashing out at fluffies for their man's slavery, their divorce rape, and their forced fathering, for example, and by lashing out at fluffy feminists for their hypocrisy and their bigotry, who preach to women their monoconscious feminism, which tells women that gender oppression is a one-way street, whereas any man who has been butchered in the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce court system knows full well that that is not the case, that women oppress men too, and in fact worse than vice versa, due to the horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes that women commit against men. When the Australian divorce courts, for example, give men joint custody and don't demand that divorcing husbands of FIP divorcing wives have to pay their ex-wives' alimony, then this is seen by masculists as a half-gender crime. Since the masculists, it's not enough that FIP women aren't given alimony, because masculists feel that fluffy women should not be given alimony either, for the simple reason, according to the masculists, that there shouldn't exist any fluffy women, period. Why? Because masculists are abolitionists. Masculists see a strong historical analogy between the Negro slavery of the 1800s in the US and the man slavery worldwide today, where man slavery is literally 1,000 times bigger problem today than was Negro slavery in the 1800s, given the numbers. There were several million Negro slaves in the US in the 1800s, while there are several billion man-slaves today in the world. Masculists are abolitionists in the sense that they aim to wipe out fluffiedom by wiping out fluffies, by effectively exterminating them, by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at, utterly rejected socially and sexually, so that fluffies are forced to die a slow, miserable death, rejected totally by men, masculisted men, in brackets, who in time will be most men. Influenced by masculist ideas, the way most women today have been influenced by feminist ideas, close brackets. To have one's masculist consciousness raised means, essentially, is to see fluffiedom as man's slavery, and man's slavery as slavery, and hence hated and a war issue to masculists. So masculists have a hatred of fluffies and fluffy feminists, seeing them as man-slaving, divorce-raping vermin, parasites to be wiped off the face of the earth. Why do masculists have such a hatred of fluffies and fluffy feminists? Masculists hate fluffies because they parasite off the labour and money of a man for decades of his life, leeching off his labour and effort for decades. Masculists have a very powerful moral argument against fluffies, and that is that it was men who liberated women from the household drudgery of a century or more back. It was men who gave women science-based medicine, so that women today have a life expectancy of 85 years. Men gave women the pill, so women now choose to have 0, 1 or 2 kids in most cases. Men gave women household gadgets and higher education, so that women now have a career window of half a century, even for those women who stay at home for some years looking after very small kids. So the masculists are now standing up, pointing the finger at women, saying, quote, "Now that you women can work, you must work. Anything else is man's slavery, and man's slavery will get you killed by the masculists, since masculists are at war against fluffiedom and aim to wipe it off the face of the earth by killing fluffies slowly, by totally ignoring them, hating them, rejecting them, forcing them to die a slow, miserable death, spitting in their faces as vile, gender criminal vermin." End quote. Masculists see the 3 main gender crimes that women commit against men, that is, man-slavery, divorce, rape, and forced fathering, as far more serious than even rape, which is one of the worst ways that men oppress women. So when bi-conscious masculists, that is, they have had both their feminist and masculist consciousnesses raised, hear a monoconscious feminist lashing out at men for the ways that men oppress women, these masculists become very angry and hateful at the hypocritical bigotry of these monoconscious feminists and bite their fucking heads off with verbally vicious attacks on them, telling them that monoconscious feminism is a deeply misandrist, gynocentric ideology that preaches to women that gender oppression is a one-way street, when bi-conscious masculists know that it is not, that gender crimes are committed in both directions, and that in fact women's gender crimes against men, e.g. the big 3 mentioned above, are far worse, since they are both horrible and last decades, which makes them far more serious than the relatively minor ways that men oppress women. So, in the context of the divorce courts, masculists see the partial reforms listed above, for example, joint custody, no alimony paid to FIP ex-wives, as only halfway house, that is, only a half injustice. To masculists, the real injustice is fluffiedom, and the hypocrisy and bigotry of fluffy feminists who still see men as cash machines, who still use the fluffy model as the basis of their decisions in the divorce courts. If you see women as fluffies, if you base your decisions in the divorce courts on the assumption that a large percentage of women appearing in the divorce courts are fluffies, then it will seem logical to you that since the husband/father earns the money, then he must pay the wife/mother alimony, pay her his house, make child payments to her, pay half his wealth and stuff to her, because she is a fluffy. Since if she doesn't butcher him in this way, then how will she live and raise her children as a fluffy? The much deeper solution to this problem, proposed and pushed by the Masculists, is the creation of a FIP society, so that all women are FIPs, raised by parents and teachers to be FIPs, so that the massive, horrible gender injustices committed by women in the divorce courts become a thing of the past, so that divorce courts operate on a principle of financial independence, so that both the mother and the father are presumed to be FIPs, so that both of them are financially capable of paying their own way and do not expect to parasite off the labour and money of another person for decades of their lives. Masculists have a hatred of fluffies and aim to kill them off. I would not like to be an 18-year-old young woman 5 years from now who gets the reputation in her high school of being a fluffy, since that may drive her to suicide, as her male classmates, who in the previous 5 years have been strongly influenced by Masculist ideas and see her as vermin, who has not bothered to FIP up by not bothering to study career competent majors at high school, so inevitably will be a fluffy as an adult, who will then look around for some stupid, gullible, man-slavable man to parasite off for decades of his life. Of course, 5 years from now, it's highly likely that nearly all young men will have been powerfully influenced by Masculist and MGTOW ideas, and will spit at her for being a hated, man-slaving, divorce-raping, vermin parasite who intends to leech off the labour and money of a man for decades of his life. To the Masculists in her class, she is such a hated gender criminal that these young men will feel she deserves to die a slow, miserable death by rotting on the shelf, manless and spat at. Being manless, she'll probably be babyless, and if she wants a kid, she'll have to both raise the kid and have a career, which is virtually impractical, so she will be poor and socially and sexually rejected. Millions of such fluffy young women will then probably suicide, so that millions of young women will pour into STEM and the professions in order not to be seen by young men as fluffies, as man-slaving, divorce-raping parasites, to be killed off slowly by being utterly rejected by men, cast out, pariahed, left to die. Masculists hate fluffies and the fluffy model that dominates the divorce courts and aim to wipe out both. Masculists have a hatred of the hypocrisy and bigotry of fluffy feminists, that is, those feminists who still have fluffy values, who still see men as cash machines put on this earth to pay for women to have babies. The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women, working for decades of their lives for a man-slaving, divorce-raping, parasitic leech of a woman who deserves to die, to be spat at for being a decades-lasting leech of a man. The level of hatred of the Masculists against fluffiedom will become so strong that women will be forced, in capital letters, into becoming FIPs. Or not only will they not get a man, they will probably be driven to suicide by men, masculisted men, who will spit at such women in their faces, totally rejecting them. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 610 plus Masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.